Coming up on the Threat Status Podcast, we talk to Bill Wolf, President and CEO of the Space Force Association, about the future of the U.S. Space Force, private industry's role in it, China's long-term military plans in space, and a lot more. And then we break down the latest on the dramatic political upheaval in Syria, the stunning death in Moscow of a top Russian general, and the long-awaited crescendo in the fight over TikTok's future in the United States. Don't forget to go to WashingtonTimes.com and sign up for the daily Threat Status newsletter. Hello and welcome to the Threat Status Podcast. I'm your host, Ben Wolfgang, national security correspondent at the Washington Times, and I'm joined, as always, by my esteemed co-host, Guy Taylor, the national security editor here at the Times. Happy holidays to all of our listeners. Of course, good show coming up for you this week. I've got an exclusive interview with Bill Wolf, the president and CEO of the Space Force Association, which I conducted on the ground at the Space Power Conference in Orlando, Florida last week. So really interesting stuff from Bill Wolf coming up on China's intentions with its space program, what the U.S. needs to do to keep pace with China, whether the Space Force budget is big enough, whether it has enough personnel. We get into all that with Bill Wolf coming up. But before we get to that, Guy, first things first, as always, what's on your radar right now?
Thanks, Ben. Great to be here for another week on the podcast. First off, I'm tracking the statements of several top Russian officials who say Moscow is going to retaliate against Ukraine for the apparent Ukrainian assassination operation on December 17 that killed a prominent Russian military general, Lieutenant General Igor Kirillov, the head of the Russian military's nuclear, biological, and chemical protection forces. This happened outside this general's apartment building in Moscow. It was a pretty stunning attack.
Reminded me, Guy, in some ways of something you might see the Israelis pull off. It seemed like almost that style of attack, a bomb hidden in a scooter.
It was that style of attack. Ukraine has claimed responsibility for this, and I think it demonstrated the growing offensive capabilities of Ukraine's intelligence services. The assassination involved a remotely triggered bomb hidden in a scooter that was placed outside the Russian general's apartment building. A key detail here, Ben, and listeners can go read more on this in the Threat Status newsletter at the Washington Times, easily findable via Google. A key detail is that Ukraine's security service, or SBU, has publicly claimed that General Kirillov has overseen the use of chemical weapons in Ukraine by Russian forces. Moscow, of course, denies that. And in fact, Moscow has accused Ukraine of using chemical weapons. Another thing on my radar, Ben, is the way that President-elect Trump has now weighed in on the developments in Syria, where the longtime Assad dictatorship was overthrown earlier this month by Sunni Muslim militants groups led by Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, or HTS. Trump spoke about it at a big press conference at Mar-a-Lago, asserting that the only way HTS was able to pull off the surprise sacking of Damascus was because Turkey and Turkish President Tayyip Erdogan backed the move. This was pretty eye-opening. It's quite a statement from President-elect Trump. A lot of regional sources are speculating about Turkey's involvement. Trump just flat out claimed that the militants that ousted Assad are, quote, controlled by Turkey, end quote. The Erdogan government hasn't responded to that statement yet, Ben. We're tracking it at Threat Status. Remember, there are about 900 U.S. Special Operations Forces in Syria to try and prevent a resurgence of ISIS or Islamic State extremist terrorist operations. Trump has actually said he wants those troops out. The whole situation is fluid and dangerous. Let me give you a little bit of analysis here. The sacking of the Assad regime also fits with Saudi Arabia's interests. The Assad regime was backed by Iran, the Shiite Muslim powerhouse that's a rival of oil-rich Sunni Muslim-dominated Saudi Arabia. The catch is that Turkey and Saudi Arabia don't see eye to eye. Erdogan sees Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, commonly known as MBS, as a rival. This is tricky for the incoming Trump administration. My read is that Trump is now publicly suggesting that Tayyip Erdogan in Turkey has somehow gained an advantage over the Saudis in Syria. I'm sure that there's a lot going on behind the scenes here, Ben. Around the time that Trump was making his comments claiming Turkey is running HTS, the Erdogan government was actually putting out statements saying that Turkey wants the Saudis and the United Arab Emirates to stand together with Turkey in supporting a new government in Syria. So it's really like the Erdogan government trying to take the lead. However you read the tea leaves here, Ben, and they're complicated tea leaves, the balance of power is shifting dramatically right now away from Iran in the Middle East and towards something that could be an alignment of Turkey, the Saudis, and the Emiratis. And I think that's going to be the challenge for the incoming administration. Can they bring about or support that alignment, and does it fit with U.S. interests?
There's so many moving parts to this story, Guy. I mean, one of the things that's jumped out to me in recent days was Bashar Assad and his first comment since Damascus fell to the rebels, saying that he was evacuated to a Russian military base, and subsequently, when that base came under rebel fire, the Russians forcibly evacuated him from Syria and to Moscow. Essentially, the subtext of his comments, the way that I read it, were that he didn't want to leave, that he wanted to sort of, follow the Volodymyr Zelensky playbook and stay behind and fight in his country and be seen as a strong leader fighting against the rebels. That didn't happen. Is he just trying to, rewrite history here and make himself look good? Or do you think Putin, Russia, had the power to literally get the head of state of Syria out of the country against his will?
I don't know. I think he's trying to rewrite history and cover himself. I think what's going on here with Russia and Syria is very interesting. I've had some regional sources tell me that there's a kind of conspiracy theory moving around the Middle East that somehow there's a deal in which the incoming Trump team signaled to Russia that if Russia got out of Syria, that would give Russia an upper hand in holding the territory it's taken in eastern Ukraine in an end of war negotiation in Ukraine. I personally think that's conspiracy theory. I don't have reporting it, but I've heard a few people talking about it. I want to jump to one more item, Ben. The latest on the preponderance of mysterious drone sightings in skies over New Jersey and other states on the U.S. East Coast in recent weeks. Multiple U.S. federal agencies put out a statement on December 17. The FBI, Department of Homeland Security, FAA, the Pentagon joined together that basically said some of the objects seen and recorded on cell phone cameras have actually been drones operated by law enforcement. Some have not been drones at all, but commercial flights. Some are hobbyists. Many are actually airplanes, helicopters, or even stars mistaken for drones. So you can imagine that that statement was pretty frustrating to people who got cell phone footage and feel like what they are looking at are SUV-sized drones flying around. The Pentagon has actually separately said that there's no U.S. intelligence pointing to a, quote, foreign nexus, end quote, relating to these drone sightings. The Pentagon has also said outright that what's been spotted in New Jersey is in no way tied to some secret U.S. military experiment or research. These are not U.S. military contractors or DOD-sanctioned drones. My read here, Ben, is that Americans are now living in a country saturated with increasingly sophisticated and technically advanced commercial, private, and government-operated drones. And the tracking and regulation of this whole situation by the U.S. government is basically inadequate right now at the federal, state, and local levels. The House Intelligence Committee got a classified briefing in recent days from FBI officials, federal law enforcement, after which we then saw several lawmakers in the House and the Senate suddenly awake to the fact that state and local municipalities lack authority to interdict mystery drones or take them down. Federal agencies currently do have this authority, but their reach is actually limited. A drone goes up and the FBI might be hundreds of miles away. So We actually saw outgoing Democratic Party Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer come out and say he wants a bill on the table ASAP to give the authority to state agencies to basically take down a drone if they think there's a mystery drone. As we're taping this, Ben, there's a fight playing out on Capitol Hill because you've got some libertarian Republicans, specifically Rand Paul, saying let's not rush to limit Americans' rights over drones. So there's a government intervention issue here. There's a national security element to it. It's just a sticky situation, and I think it's the new normal. We're going to hear more about this, the more saturation and proliferation that there is of more and more advanced drones.
Well, I mean, and you always have to worry about the unintended consequences here. That if we do, in fact, give permission to New Jersey State patrolmen to get out of their cars and start trying to shoot down drones, on the side of the highway somewhere, what does that look like? I mean,
Good question.
there's all kinds
Good
of
question.
ramifications to this debate right now, and it's certainly something we're going to track because, as you say, it is in fact the new normal. There's not going to be fewer drones in American skies, I don't think, absent some major new regulation or policy at the federal level. So,
I also think there's a social media element to this story, that this thing is like a runaway train. I do not know, and I have not seen analysis from the federal government or privately of how many videos were actually taken. Are we talking about 10 or 12 videos, or are we talking about thousands? Because it seems like the way that the narrative and the story has moved, that there are thousands of people who've taken video of things that look like large drones moving around in the night skies. But I've looked at a lot of these videos myself, and I'm skeptical as well. So I don't want to just dismiss the government statement out of hand. I think there are a lot of sides to this.
and part of the issue too, we had Representative Nancy Mace on the show a couple of weeks ago to talk about UAP, or unidentified anomalous phenomenon. One of the frustrations she feels like there's too much segmentation of information. Things are overclassified, so you might have folks from the FBI or even the DoD who are giving these briefings in good faith, telling people what they know and what they believe to be true, but they might not have access to certain information or be aware of certain military research programs or new types of drones experiments that are being flown over the U.S. So it gets complicated in a hurry with a whole bunch of national security implications at play here, Guy. And speaking of national security implications, we're watching TikTok because this long-running saga over TikTok's future in the United States finally seems to be reaching a crescendo here, Guy. The Supreme Court said today, as we're taping on Wednesday, that it will hear a case brought by TikTok, which is owned by the China-based parent company ByteDance. This case challenges U.S. legislation that requires ByteDance to sell TikTok to their company or cease its operations in the United States. That ban is scheduled to take effect on January 19th, one day before Donald Trump's inauguration. So Trump has to love this, right? I mean, talk about political and legal theater. It's a huge deal. We've talked on this show a lot about how critics believe TikTok is essentially a tool of the Chinese Communist Party and is a critical piece of what they say is a really sophisticated and long-term scheme to influence American society, undermine our faith in government, and sow discord in the United States.
Actually, Ben, if listeners want to get the inside track on that, I went out and sat down for a 15-minute special video piece with Raja Krishnamurthy, the Illinois Democrat who actually wrote the legislation that became this ban on TikTok. So that can be found on the threat status pages at the Washington Times. It's a great piece, and Krishnamurthy goes inside a lot of this stuff,
right?
And it's just from a couple of months ago.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you've been at the forefront. I think at threat status, we've kind of been covering this story for a long time and been at the forefront of some of this reporting. For his part, Trump said this week he has a soft spot for TikTok, so it's possible his administration could try to short circuit this ban, regardless of what the Supreme Court ends up doing. An estimated 170 million people, at least according to TikTok, in the U.S. use the platform. Trump seems to believe his campaign did a good job of using it to reach some crucial swing state voters. Now, if this story wasn't juicy enough already, which it obviously is, but there's another side as well. The European Union this week, guys, said it's investigating TikTok for its alleged role in a suspected Russian plot to influence the Romanian presidential election. This really jumped out to me for a number of reasons, and I highlighted it prominently in the Threat Status newsletter because of how, in my view, it's a clear example of something you often bring up, which is connective tissue between the axis of authoritarians, China, Russia, Iran, North Korea. in what ways are they actually working together on a daily basis right now to undermine democracy, attack the U.S., disrupt the global order, however you want to put it? The EU believes that Russia-linked figures spearheaded a complex campaign to promote long-shot presidential candidate Călin Georgescu, who ended up winning the first round of voting in the Romanian election. Now, a Romanian court subsequently threw out those results because of this alleged TikTok scheme, which Romanian and EU authorities say involved payments of at least $381,000 to powerful TikTok influencers to promote that candidate, and apparently it worked. Now, we should say, in fairness, of course, TikTok has been talking a lot about this publicly for a while now, and the company has a detailed public statement, which you can find online, in which it says it detected and disrupted covert influence networks involved in the scheme. So that's some of the connective tissue, at least allegedly, that we're always looking for, right? Russia-backed cyber operatives using a China-controlled app to go after election integrity in a NATO member country. Not the first time they've done that. That's for sure, but it's still a very telling and timely example. The bottom line for me, Guy, all of these things are coming to a head right now at the same time. All of these suspicions about TikTok, the long-running fight in the U.S., should we ban it, should we not? The fears about national security implications in the U.S. and in Europe. Should it be left alone because of free speech principles? That's all being decided now in the next few weeks, politically, in terms of what the Trump administration does, legally at the Supreme Court, internationally with what the EU may do with its investigation. By this time next month, if not sooner, Guy, the U.S. and the world will be in a very different place with respect to a social media app that's taken on at this point an outsized role both in our lives and in national security and global influence debates. And I am joined now by Bill Wolf. He is the president and CEO of the Space Force Association, joining us here at the Space Power 2024 convention in Orlando, Florida. Bill, it's a pleasure to have you on the show. If you would, for listeners who might not be familiar, give us a brief overview of the Space Force Association and what you all do.
You bet. Thanks so much, Ben. I really appreciate taking time to explain what the Space Force Association is and what we're working on. So the Space Force Association is a nonprofit military organization focused on ensuring we have the resources necessary and advocating for a strong U.S. Space Force, and not just the U.S., but to include our partners and allies to make sure there's those partnerships that we focus on. And it's a membership-based organization, so people can't join the Space Force, but they can join the Space Force Association.
Okay. This morning, you mentioned while you were on stage this idea of right-sizing the Space Force. Does the Space Force have the resources it needs right now to match the growing threats that we see?
Absolutely not. When the Space Force was signed into law on December 20th of 2019, former President Trump signed it into law because he knew the potential threat. Now, when Congress approved it, they did not. They put the kind of the handcuffs on the service and said, "You will not grow." And so, for the past 4 years, the Space Force has not grown significantly. And I think in this next administration, I think we're going to see that get fixed.
One thing that I'm curious about, you mentioned Congress. In writing about AI and tech, there's a narrative out there that is Congress smart enough to sort of regulate AI and tech? A lot of these are older folks. Do they have the necessary expertise to make decisions on that sort of thing? Does that apply to space as well? Do you think Congress as a whole, not any individual members singling anybody out, but as a whole, as a body, do they understand the complex nature of what we're talking about here with the space domain?
Well, some of them definitely do. I mean, you can look at the folks who helped found the Space Force, with Representative Rogers, for example. But collectively, no. There's not a lot of people who understand why space is so critical, because a lot of them understand the civil sector, but they don't have a clear understanding of the national security sector. We've got plenty of veterans, retirees, who are from other services that are represented in Senate and Congress, but there aren't any Space Force veterans represented on the Hill. Yeah. So that's a definite problem. Now, what SFA does is we engage on the Hill on a regular basis by creating educational opportunities for staffers and principals and make sure that we're doing our job to educate them on the criticality of the service.
From where you sit, Bill, what's the right way for us all, for folks like myself who are writing stories about this, to frame the U.S. versus China competition in space? Because you talk to some folks in industry here, especially off the record, if you get sort of their blunt thoughts on this, is that we're not where we need to be vis-a-vis China. Without, asking you to fearmonger too much here, what is the right way to look at that?
Here's the way I would compare what's happening in the U.S. versus what's happening in China. It's an inverse pyramid. And on the bottom of the pyramid is national security space. At the top of the pyramid is commercial, so the base of the pyramid, which is on top, is the commercial industry and how much money they're spending on space programs. And then right in between is the civil sector. And if the national security apparatus doesn't have the resources and policy support that it needs, the entire pyramid crumbles, which means the U.S., partners and allies, do not control a future $1.3 trillion space economy, while our potential adversaries are creating space capabilities that are doing some crazy things to hold our critical assets at risk. They don't have that same encumbrance from policy. And so it's a block. That's what that looks like. If you compare an inverse pyramid to a block, that's China. Everything they do in space is national security.
What are their, not to ask you to speak for the Chinese Communist Party, but what are their overall goals in space? And are we, as the U.S., doing an effective job to counter them right now?
Their overall goal is to be able to, again, whenever you talk about any domain superiority, it's ensuring you have the freedom of action in the domain and denying your adversary's action in the domain. Yeah. So I suspect they're doing exactly that. They want to ensure they have the freedom of action in the space domain while denying us that same activity. So everything they're doing from a policy perspective, from a commercial production perspective, from a national security space perspective, is they are inundating the domain with a lot of very unique technology and capabilities, and they're not, again, encumbered by any kind of policy, so they can do whatever they want.
I'm glad you said that, because I'm always struck by just sort of the natural position the U.S. finds ourselves in, because we do adhere to certain ethical standards, moral codes. We don't want to disrupt the population's water supply or take down the banking system for the middle class in China or Russia, but they do want to do that to us. So does that just naturally put the U.S. at a disadvantage when we have some of these conversations?
Absolutely, 100%, because we don't know what the impact would be if we had a day without space. Where, the problem would be is if we had that, then it would completely disrupt our way of life.
Yeah.
We would cease to understand how critical we'd start to understand how critical it was.
Is it going to take, God forbid, none of us want that, but is it going to take something like that to happen for the average American and maybe even some policymakers on Capitol Hill to fully grasp that?
Well, here's what we're doing at the Space Force Association is we're going into Hollywood, and we're trying to help tell a story that needs to be told about the criticality of the Space Force. So until people start seeing what the Space Force is and what the impact could be, it's going to take some terrible disaster for us to wake up and say, we should have done something about this.
Yeah. Bill, you're an Air Force guy, so I certainly don't need to tell you how important, private industry and contractors are to the U.S. aerospace from a military perspective. But it seems like it's pretty unique when it comes to space, how important the commercial sector and private industry is to virtually everything the Space Force is doing. How does that interplay between those two sides, industry and the military, look from where you sit?
It's interesting because you have unique technologies on the Air Force side for the air domain. Exquisite radar, exquisite weapon systems that we use to ensure that we protect pilots and execute and prosecute targets from a air dominance perspective. You don't see that in the commercial side of things in the air domain. And the space domain, however, they're linked.
Yeah.
They're the same technologies. And so it becomes, how do you use that technology in such a way that it augments DoD necessities? And so I think you're going to see where you have a very clear line in the air domain between military aircraft and commercial aircraft. You're not going to see a very clear line between DoD capabilities and how commercial is integrated into executing space objectives or space superiority objectives in that domain.
What are some of the potential problems that can arise from that? Because I know it's some roundtable discussions I've been to with military officials. They say, I want to leverage commercial capabilities as much as possible in terms of data and whatever else I can use private satellites that are up there to get. Now, if we end up in a conflict and China starts taking out those privately owned commercial satellites, what does that mean? Does the government reimburse them for that cost? What are you hearing those kind of concerns from the commercial side?
That's exactly what the commercial side is talking about is, hey, I'm willing to accept that risk, but at what cost? Am I willing to accept that risk? So those are the conversations that need to be had. So if China says, hey, I'm going to take out every single Starlink satellite, or every single Starlink satellite is a potential target, what happens when? And so, those conversations, I'm sure, are taking place behind the scenes. But let's get that out into the open and better understand that so we can turn that into the necessary policy to turn into a practice.
Last thing, Bill, I'm wondering in terms of keeping track of how much stuff is up there. There was a story out today, I'm sure you probably saw, about these mysterious drones flying over New Jersey. There's an increasing amount of stuff in the sky that we don't seem to know what it is. And as more and more countries are putting stuff into space, is there a danger that there just gets to be so much stuff up there that we start to lose track of what's what, and how do you prevent against that?
Well, all you have to do is look back at air traffic control.
Yeah.
And so we created air traffic control, and so we can see all the planes. And if you see that map of all the planes, and we know what happened after certain instances throughout history, what happens to the air traffic, let's do the same thing in space. We have to create a space traffic management plan, and maybe we start looking at, do we need a federal space administration to manage space traffic? And
similar to the FAA.
Similar to the FAA. If we're saying Federal Aviation Administration takes care of air traffic control, where's the Federal Space Administration to take care of space traffic management?
How complex an agency would that be? I mean, that's a pretty heavy lift, right?
Well, now we're talking about what does efficiency look like within government?
Yeah.
And I suspect the new administration is going to tackle that. But if you ask me, I think we need to start looking at establishing a Department of the Space Force at a minimum, and at a maximum, let's start looking at what would a Department of Space actually look like based on the critical infrastructure that the space domain provides.
Yeah. Bill Wolf, thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate it.
Thanks so much, Ben. Have a great day.
And it's time now for Threat of the Week, our weekly segment here in the show where Guy and I each identify a threat, whether it's here at home, domestically in the U.S., or in some corner of the world that's impacting U.S. national security right now this week as you all are listening to the show. Guy, what do you have as your threat of the week?
My threat of the week, Ben, is that the U.S. federal government is unable to effectively regulate the rapidly expanding presence of drones of all kinds in skies over the United States. I see what's happening in New Jersey and a few other states, notably Maryland, as the beginning of a trend we're going to see more of over the coming year. And I think there are national security implications. Foreign actors could take advantage of the chaos of this space right now and infiltrate U.S. airspace with fleets of advanced drones, if only to spur more fear and chaos.
It's something worth keeping an eye on, that's for sure. Guy, my threat of the week is China's rapid military buildup and the direct threat it poses to America. There's a number of angles to this one, and of course, we could spend a whole episode, and we have, in fact, in the past, talking about China's military capabilities. But our colleague Bill Gertz, friend of the show, had a troubling story this week on a new Pentagon report that represented one of the most in-depth looks recently at the People's Liberation Army, its goals, and what it can do. Some big picture headlines here quickly. China has added hundreds of new missiles over the past year, 100 new nuclear warheads. They've added 50 new ICBMs, 300 new medium-range ballistic missiles, 100 new long-range ground-launched cruise missiles, all since 2023. And last but certainly not least, 3 million troops. This doesn't even get into the size of its Navy, which is bigger than the U.S., or its cyber capabilities, its work on AI, influence operations, which some would say includes TikTok, other assets, hypersonic weapons. How are they doing this so quickly? Guy, part of the answer, I think, can be found in your conversation on last week's show with Steve Blank of Stanford University. He said China's a lot more like Silicon Valley these days, while the U.S. is more like General Motors, and that we lack that whole-of-nation approach to marshal ourselves and move quickly enough.
He's specifically talking about military industrial production capability.
Let's face it, that's part of how China is able to, pull off some of these eye-popping numbers of that many missiles, that many nuclear warheads, etc. And if you're not worried enough already, here's a little bit more. At the Space Power Conference last week in Orlando, which I attended, General Saltzman, the U.S. Chief of Space Operations, he reminded everyone during a keynote speech that since 2022, past 2 years, China's launched over 400 satellites, half of which are designed to find, fix, track, and target objects on Earth. And by 2029, China plans to launch another 1,300. The commander of U.S. Space Forces Indo-Pacific, Brigadier General Anthony Mastelier, he told reporters at a small roundtable discussion that China's specific goals include being able to track and target U.S. high-value assets from the first island chain, the second island chain, and eventually, quote, all the way to the west coast of California, unquote. So I guess the silver lining here, guys, we know this is coming. China's not sneaking up on anyone anymore with its military preparations. But my goodness, when you look at the sheer scale and scope, all those numbers, the sheer scale and scope of Beijing's military buildup, it's the very definition of a threat right now.
Certainly, Ben, we are in an era of great power competition between China and the United States at this point, and this is just part of it.
Yeah. Absolutely. It's not going to slow down. That's for sure. Well, thank you all so much. A huge thanks to Bill Wolf of the Space Force Association for joining us here in the show. Big thanks to you, Guy. Big thanks to all of you, as always, for listening. Happy holidays. Please go ahead, hit that subscribe button, share with all of your friends. Guy Taylor and I will be off next week for the holidays, but we will see you all again in 2025. Thanks for listening to the Threat Status Podcast.